was March 24th, 2023, and the local police in Banjarnegara, a small town in central Java, had just begun their day. Banjarnegara is a place that is shaped by simplicity. It's a quiet and picturesque town, and life here mostly revolves around agriculture, with vast green rice paddies stretching endlessly into the horizon, bordered by the thick, jungled hills that frame the region. But beneath its peaceful surface, this small town in Indonesia holds secrets that few could ever imagine. Inside the police station, the scent of damp earth and strong coffee filled the air, while ceiling fans struggled against the humidity. Officers were used to the lazy hum of routine, cigarette smoke curling from their lips as they sat back in their chairs, scanning the morning reports. But very quickly, this quiet hum was shattered when a young man burst through the doors, his face pale and his voice trembling. He had traveled 8 hours from the province of West Java in a frantic search for his father, Prasetyo, who had been missing for 3 whole days. One of the officers stood up, gently pulling him aside. The young man said that his father's last known location was in Banjarnegara, the town they were in. Their last point of contact had been on WhatsApp, where his father had mentioned something about visiting a spiritual shaman in the area. But what truly sent chills through the room was the final message sent from his father. "If I don't come back, come to this location and bring the police for help." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just a missing persons case. There was something more, something dark. What no one realized at that moment was that this message would set off a chilling investigation. It was the first clue that would lead the police to a horrifying discovery: 12 bodies buried in the backyard of a man's home. The hunt for a serial killer had just begun. You're listening to Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast produced by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Despite its rapid modernization, Indonesia remains a country where ancient traditions and superstitions still hold significant power. In cities like Jakarta, skyscrapers rise above streets filled with motorbikes and street vendors. The urban centers hum with life and progress, boasting modern tech hubs and burgeoning businesses. Yet in rural areas like Banjarnegara, the influence of dukuns or spiritual leaders remain deeply embedded in daily life. Loosely translated to mean spiritual leader, dukuns have played an important role in Indonesian culture for hundreds of years. They are respected for their believed powers to heal sickness, protect people from harm, and give advice on both physical and spiritual matters. Whether it's using herbal remedies, performing rituals, or communicating with spirits, locals regard them as powerful figures who bridge the gap between the human world and the supernatural. Although many of them are respected and have good intentions, others exploit this belief for personal gain. The question is, at what cost? In March 2023, a man rushed into a police station in Banjarnegara, panicked and desperate. His father, Prasetyo, had been missing for 3 days, and he feared the worst after receiving a chilling message from him. The son showed the officers the message, which read, "If I don't come back, come to this location and bring the police for help." With the gravity of the situation clear, the police wasted no time, but deep down, all of them had a lingering fear that they were too late. Following the coordinates in the message, the officers arrived at the home of a man known as Tohari Slamet, or more famously, Mbah Slamet. As they approached the property, the officers exchanged skeptical looks. The house stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by overgrown grass, with mist rising from the nearby fields in the early morning air. After knocking on the door, Slamet appeared, greeting the officers with a soft smile. On the outside, he looked just like any other villager in the area, a man with a graying beard, weathered skin, and deep lines on his forehead. His eyes seemed kind, his demeanor calm, even friendly. Yet, you couldn't help but sense that there was an unsettling stillness about him. "Good morning," he said quietly. With serious looks on their faces, the officers informed him that Prasetyo's last known location was at this house, and they weren't leaving until they had answers. But Mbah Slamet simply remained silent, not speaking a word. He didn't deny their accusations, nor did he offer any information. His calm, unblinking gaze never faltered. In response, the lead officer gave a nod, signaling his team to begin searching the house. It was small, unassuming, with nothing out of the ordinary inside. But outside, in the overgrown yard, something caught one officer's eye. A few meters from the house, the muddy ground looked disturbed, with a patch of freshly turned soil catching the officer's attention. He moved toward it and knelt down, running his hands through the cold, gritty earth. He began digging, cautiously at first, and not long after, the other officers joined him, working quickly. Then, one of them suddenly paused. He had felt something solid in the ground. It was a corpse. Tohari Slamet was known to the locals as the village dukun, or witch doctor. He boasted of possessing mystical powers, claiming he could heal the sick, ease people's worries, and even grant their deepest desires. But his most enticing offer was the ability to multiply money, promising to make anyone wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. With the right ritual, he claimed, fortunes could appear out of thin air, turning even the most modest savings into immense riches in a matter of moments. But he had a past that was riddled with criminal behavior. In 2019, he was arrested for possession of counterfeit rupiah bills. While the specific details surrounding this incident remain unclear, what is certain is that he had a history of scamming people long before his crimes came to light. Though the specifics of these schemes remain vague, it suggested that he was a man skilled in manipulation, preying on the vulnerable and exploiting their trust. Tohari was no stranger to taking advantage of others for personal gain, and this was an early warning of the much darker path he would eventually follow. Records state that he had served a short prison sentence in light of this crime, but when he was released, he decided to change his approach. Instead of scamming people directly, he would hide behind the veil of mysticism. Banjarnegara is a rural and spiritually rich region in central Java. It was a place where Javanese mysticism, or Kejawen, had deep roots, and the belief in the power of dukun was still strong. Here, shamans were sought for everything, from healing to protection, to success in business or personal matters. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the world came to a standstill. With businesses closing left and right, and people losing their jobs overnight, the uncertainty of the pandemic left many feeling desperate and scared. In those dark times of fear and instability, the people of Banjarnegara, like so many around the world, were looking for more than just comfort. They were searching for miracles. The virus had swept through the country, and for many locals, the future felt bleak as jobs disappeared and businesses shuttered. Without work, families were forced to stay home, watching their savings dwindle, unsure of when or if things would return to normal. Each passing day only brought more uncertainty, and for those struggling to make ends meet, hope seemed to slip further away. Stuck at home with little to do, people turned to their phones as a lifeline. Social media became an escape, a way to stay connected and search for opportunities. But for many, it was also a place where desperation grew. Even months after the worst of the pandemic had passed, the lingering effects continued to weigh heavily on the community. The economic shock that began in 2020 didn't simply disappear when lockdowns ended. For many, the damage was lasting. Jobs were scarce, businesses had folded, and financial recovery was slow, if it came at all. By 2023, the financial pressure for many had become unbearable. The promise of economic recovery seemed distant, and with savings depleted, families were vulnerable to anything that offered a glimmer of hope. Desperation often clouds judgment, and in times of hardship, even the most far-fetched solutions can appear attractive. One of the people likely caught in this ongoing struggle was Prasetyo. The pressures of financial instability had not eased for him. Like many others, he was still grappling with the aftermath of the pandemic. One late evening in March 2023, Prasetyo was lying on his bed in Sukabumi, West Java, scrolling through his phone after a long, exhausting day. For months, he had been searching for a way out, anything that could help him escape the mounting pressures of debt. It was around this time that he came across a post on Facebook, an enticing offer from a local dukun named Slamet. The dukun promised something extraordinary. For a small fee, he could make his wealth grow exponentially, and it would only take just a few hours. The promise seemed too good to be true. Yet, for someone who's been facing the weight of financial pressures, the idea of instant wealth was impossible to ignore. Without hesitation, Prasetyo jumped at the opportunity. He quickly sent a message to the dukun, expressing his interest. Within minutes, his phone buzzed again. The response came fast. Too fast. But Prasetyo was too eager to notice. "Come to my house, bring a sum of money, and the spirits will do the rest." The promise was clear. By the end of the day, his fortune would grow, and his financial worries would be over. However, Prasetyo was too eager to realize that this was merely the bait in a far more sinister scheme. As Prasetyo headed to the dukun's house, there was an unsettling tension in the air. The narrow dirt road along the way was flanked by towering trees, their leaves rustling in the breeze, as if it were warning him of the darkness that lay ahead. The closer he got, the more isolated the place felt, as if the world outside had fallen away. Opening the door, Slamet greeted him with a calm smile, ushering him inside. The house was dimly lit, its walls bare, and the air smelled faintly of incense. Meanwhile, Prasetyo handed over the money, and the ritual began with little conversation. He watched as the dukun moved with precision, lighting candles one by one and placing them in a circle around a stack of rupiah bills. As the warm, flickering light filled the room, he began to chant softly, in a language that Prasetyo didn't recognize, but the words flowed out in an almost hypnotic rhythm. With each gesture of his hands, Prasetyo's heart raced a little faster. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if he were drawing power from unseen forces. At this moment, the room seemed to grow a little heavier, with the flickering candlelight playing tricks on Prasetyo's mind, making the pile of rupiah bills appear to shift and grow before his very eyes. Then, the pile of money before him seemed to grow, as if bills were appearing out of thin air. The rumors appeared to be true. Prasetyo had seen it for himself. Slamet had seemingly transformed his modest stack of bills into an enormous sum, enough to purchase a large house in the area. It felt like a miracle, unfolding before his eyes. With his heart racing and a bag full of cash clutched tightly in his hands, he boarded a bus and fled the town of Banjarnegara, hope swelling inside him. For the first time in years, he could picture a life free from the financial burdens that had weighed him down for so long. His future seemed brighter, filled with the promise of wealth and opportunity. But that hope was short-lived. A few days later, while strolling through a market, Prasetyo confidently reached into his pocket, pulling out several of the freshly multiplied bills to hand over to a vendor. The vendor took the money, but barely glanced at it, before his expression shifted to confusion. Flipping the notes between his fingers, he suddenly stopped, his face tightening with suspicion. The vendor's voice cut sharply through the noise of the market as he declared the money to be fake. Immediately, Prasetyo's mind filled with disbelief. The vendor held one of the bills up to the light, pointing out the obvious flaws. The paper was too smooth, too pale, and lacked the intricate details found in real currency. He explained that the money wouldn't be accepted here, nor would it be accepted anywhere else. Prasetyo's chest tightened as the harsh reality began to take hold. He stared down at the fake bills in his hands, desperately wishing it was some kind of mistake. But there was no denying it. The ink was off. The texture felt wrong. Every rupiah in the bag was worthless, and along with it, the hopes and dreams he had carried with him had shattered completely. Anger surged through Prasetyo as the realization hit. He had been scammed. Meanwhile, back in Banjarnegara, Mbah Slamet was living the high life. While he was performing the ritual, he had handed Prasetyo stacks of counterfeit money while keeping the real cash for himself. And now, with Prasetyo's hard-earned savings tucked safely in his own pockets, Slamet wasted no time indulging in one of his favorite pastimes, singing his heart out at a local karaoke bar. Slamet was just as notorious for his wild spending as he was for his so-called shaman abilities, and in that moment, he acted as if he didn't have a single worry in the world. But underneath the surface, Slamet wasn't just a fraud. He was dangerous. He knew full well that one day, someone might come looking for answers. And in his twisted mind, if anyone ever dared to confront him about the scam, he had only one solution. He would silence them for good. It's now April 2023, and Mbah Slamet sat in a detention room at a police station in Banjarnegara, his face partly shrouded in shadow. Just days earlier, he had been living a life of indulgence, singing karaoke, and spending the money he had swindled from his victims without a second thought. But now, he was behind bars, charged not only with fraud, but with murder. Photos taken during his arrest capture Slamet with a hauntingly blank expression, his face devoid of emotion. His eyes were cast downward, his head lowered, as though he was already resigned to his fate. The calm exterior he had worn for so long was now replaced by a chilling stillness, leaving many to wonder what, if anything, was going on behind those cold, vacant eyes. According to reports, the authorities faced significant challenges identifying the victims due to the advanced state of decomposition. Many of the bodies had been buried for a long time, some as far back as 2020. The only person they could definitively identify was Prasetyo, leading investigators to believe he had been buried just days before the discovery. The autopsy results also revealed something even more unsettling. Traces of a mysterious poison were found in Prasetyo's system, and upon further investigation, this poison was identified as potassium cyanide. When cyanide is ingested, it quickly stops the body cells from producing energy by blocking their use of oxygen. This causes vital organs like the brain and heart to be deprived of oxygen, leading to a rapid shutdown of bodily functions. For the first few seconds after ingestion, the victim may experience dizziness, confusion, and difficulty breathing as the poison begins to take hold. Seizures often follow as the brain becomes deprived of oxygen. Breathing slows dramatically, eventually leading to apnea, which is a complete stop in your breathing. Without oxygen, the heart quickly fails, leading to cardiac arrest. Many experts rate cyanide poisoning as one of the most agonizing ways to die, as essentially, your body is suffocating from the inside. Death can occur within minutes, sometimes even in a matter of seconds. It's likely that all the victims found in Slamet's backyard met their end through cyanide poisoning. But this revelation only led to more disturbing questions. How did cyanide end up in their systems when their only intention was to have their money multiplied by the so-called shaman? Well, according to several sources, here's what happened. For Slamet, anyone who realized he wasn't the powerful dukun he claimed to be instantly became a dangerous liability, a threat to the web of lies he had spun over the years. His scams relied on secrecy, and when victims like Prasetyo realized they had been deceived, some didn't just walk away quietly. They returned, furious and determined, confronting Slamet at his home and demanding their money back. It was in these moments, when his deceptions were on the verge of being exposed, that Slamet resorted to something far deadlier than fraud. When faced with angry clients, Slamet didn't panic. Instead, he would try to soothe them, spinning the same lies that had worked so well before. He would tell them that their agitation was the problem, that if they did not calm down, the spirits would not grant their requests. Then he would invite them to participate in a ritual, convincing them it was the key to unlocking their fortunes completely. As part of this ritual, Slamet would offer his victims a drink, claiming it would clear their minds and allow the spirits to do the work. All of his victims believed him, but what they all didn't know was that each drink had been laced with potassium cyanide. You might be wondering, how did Slamet even get access to such a lethal poison? Well, in many parts of Indonesia's rural farming communities, cyanide is alarmingly easy to come by, as it's commonly used as a pesticide to protect crops. For someone like Slamet, who lived in an agricultural region, obtaining cyanide wouldn't have drawn much attention. The poison was within easy reach, and he could easily carry out his deadly plans. In the days following his arrest, police brought Mbah Slamet back to his property to gather more evidence and strengthen their case against him. What they uncovered there would prove just how extraordinarily heinous his crimes truly were. As investigators continued their search of the property, something unusual caught their eye. A small, modest building that stood in stark contrast to the grand, mansion-like home where Slamet lived. While his main house was imposing, with its 4 grand pillars and 2 floors, this smaller structure, painted a faded blue with an empty birdcage hanging by the door, seemed neglected and abandoned. When Slamet was brought there, he soon confessed that this little structure was the place where he would conduct his secret rituals. In other words, the very spot where he had lured and poisoned his victims. Photos released by local news outlets showed the inside of the small house, a cramped, windowless room with its 4 walls painted white. There was no ventilation, and the space was so tight it barely allowed for any movement. It was unbearably claustrophobic. The reports also included a statement from Slamet's wife, who informed authorities that no one, not even she, was ever permitted to enter the structure. She explained that her husband had built the building shortly after they moved in the area, and from that moment on, he had kept it strictly off-limits. Meanwhile, police uncovered another strange detail inside the small house. Beneath the carpets, they found a deep hole in the ground with a small puddle of water at the bottom. This hole seemed entirely out of place, leaving investigators puzzled about its purpose. When they questioned Slamet about the hole, his response was as chilling as it was revealing. He explained that this was where he would stage his money-multiplying trick, using the hole to pull the counterfeit bills through the ground. making his victims believe that the money had appeared out of nowhere. This illusion was key to his entire scheme because it successfully convinced his victims that he truly did possess real supernatural abilities, at least until they discovered the money was fake. In the end, Tohari Slamet's conviction was inevitable. His confession, along with the overwhelming physical evidence, left no doubt about his guilt. By January 2024, the Indonesian courts found him guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced him to death, ensuring that his trail of terror would never claim another victim. For the families of the victims, many of whom attended the trial in person, this verdict brought a much-needed sense of closure. Additionally, the panel of judges overseeing the case unanimously ruled that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment for a man like Slamet. They highlighted his complete lack of remorse and his cold, emotionless demeanor throughout the proceedings. His lack of care, as they said, left no doubt in their minds about the severity of his actions. But while his conviction marked the end of his killing spree, the judges acknowledged a sobering reality. Slamet was not the only fraudulent shaman preying on the vulnerable in Indonesia's remote villages, and he likely wouldn't be the last. Roughly 10% of Indonesia's population lives below the poverty line, and for many in these far-flung rural communities, life is a daily struggle, with dreams of financial security seeming forever out of reach. In their desperation to escape hardship, many turn to shamans, trusting that these spiritual leaders held the power to change their fortunes. But the harsh reality is that not all shamans are what they claim to be. You see, shamans have long been revered figures in Indonesian society, especially in rural communities where access to modern healthcare, education, and financial systems is limited. They offer hope when modern solutions seem out of reach, and for many, their rituals and knowledge provide comfort in times of crisis. In a country where mystical beliefs are woven into everyday life, the power and influence of a spiritual leader can rival that of doctors, teachers, and local leaders. This deep-seated cultural tradition opens the door for exploitation, allowing men like Slamet to operate with little suspicion. They disguise themselves as healers, but their real motives are far more sinister. While Prasetyo's death brought the crime to light, he wasn't the first victim of Slamet's schemes. Behind each of the bodies found buried on his property was a person with hopes and dreams, people that were just seeking a way out of their struggles. Many came from humble backgrounds, providing for their families, only to have their trust betrayed in the worst possible way. One of these victims was a local farmer named Budi, a hard-working individual who had spent years tending his fields in the hopes of a better life. Each day he toiled under the sun, working the land with the dream that one day his hard work would pay off. But no matter how much he harvested, the profits were never enough. When Budi heard of a dukun who could multiply money, he saw it as his chance to finally break free from the cycle of poverty. Gathering his life savings, Budi made the fateful trip to Banjarnegara, just like Prasetyo. But instead of prosperity, he found his grave. Slamet's story isn't just one of deceit and murder. It's a chilling reminder of how desperation can cloud judgment and how easily belief can be manipulated. For the rural communities in Indonesia, the challenge now is not just about seeking justice for those who lost their lives to Slamet. It's about rebuilding trust in a system that has existed for centuries. How can the people continue to trust their spiritual leaders when the line between spiritual guide and predator has been so thoroughly blurred? The reality is that those who prey on hope are often the most dangerous. And while Slamet may have been caught, others like him are still out there, lurking in the shadows of Indonesia's remote villages, waiting for their next victim. The question now is, how many more will fall for the same deadly trick? Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, is brought to you by One Up Media. This episode was produced and written by Guangjin, edited by Alex, narrated by Jason, audio experience by Ethan Sam, additional engineering by Ashley from One Up Media. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.